The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, a FreeSchool Abridged classic. If you enjoy this story, visit freeschoolpublishing.com to find more simplified and abridged classics. In the heart of a cove, on the eastern shore of the Hudson, lies a broad stretch of the river called the Tappan Zee. There sits the small market port known as Tarrytown. Not far from this village there is a little valley. It is one of the quietest places in the whole world. The odd whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks the peace. This isolated glen is known by the name of Sleepy Hollow. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land. It fills the very air. Some say that the place is enchanted and holds a spell over the minds of its people. They walk in a constant daydream. Often they see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood swarms with haunted spots and superstitions. The main spirit that haunts this place is a phantom on horseback without a head. Some say it is the ghost of a Hessian trooper. His head was carried off by a cannonball in the Revolutionary War. Sometimes he hurries through the gloom of night, as if on the wings of the wind. His haunts extend to a nearby church. Indeed, some historians claim that his body was buried in the churchyard. The ghost rides out to the place of battle each night in search of his head. Then he rushes through the hollow to get back to the churchyard before dawn. He is known as the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. In this out-of-the-way corner, there lived a worthy teacher named Ichabod Crane. The name of Crane suited him. He was tall, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, and feet like shovels. His head was small and flat on top. He had huge ears, large glassy green eyes, and a long beak of a nose. It looked like a weather vane perched on his spindly neck to tell how the wind blew. When he strode along the top of a hill on a windy day, one might have mistaken him for some scarecrow who escaped from a cornfield. His schoolhouse was a low one-room building built out of logs. The windows were partly glass and patched with pages from old workbooks. It stood at the foot of a wooded hill. A brook ran close by, and a large birch tree grew at one end of it. From there, the murmur of his students' voices might be heard on a summer's day, like the hum of a beehive. They were interrupted now and then by the voice of the master, or perhaps the awful sound of the switch would be heard as he urged some straggler along the path of knowledge. He always kept in mind the proverb, "Spare the rod and spoil the child." Ichabod Crane's scholars certainly were not spoiled. When school was over, he played with the larger boys. On holiday afternoons, he walked some of the smaller ones home. These often happened to have pretty sisters or good cooks for mothers. It was worthwhile for him to keep on good terms with his pupils. The income from his school was scarcely enough to feed him. He was a huge eater, and though he was thin, he could expand like an anaconda. To help support him, he was fed and lodged at the houses of the farmers whose children he taught. With these, he lived a week at a time in turn. He made his rounds of the neighborhood, with all his belongings tied up in a cotton handkerchief. Most of the parents saw the cost of schooling as a dreadful burden. So that it might not be too hard on them, he made himself useful. He helped the farmers to make hay, mended the fences, took the horses to water, drove the cows from pasture, and cut wood for the winter fire. He laid aside, too, all the dignity with which he ruled the school. Instead, he became wonderfully gentle and charming. He found favor in the eyes of the mothers by making much of their children. With a child on one knee, he would rock a cradle with his foot for hours. Along with his other career, he made extra money by teaching the young folks to sing hymns. On Sundays, he proudly took his place in the front of the church with a band of chosen singers. There, he thought, he completely stole attention from the parson. Certainly his voice rang far above all the rest of the congregation. There are still odd quavers in that church that are said to have come from the nose of Ichabod Crane. Thus, he lived well enough. The schoolmaster is a man of some importance to the ladies of a country neighborhood. He is seen as a kind of gentleman. He has better taste and more education than the local young men. Ichabod was happy in the smiles of all the country maidens. Often he walked with them in the churchyard on Sundays. The more bashful country lads hung back. They envied his elegance and easy speech. The women were always pleased to see him when he arrived at a new house. After all, he knew all the local gossip. They also respected him as a man of great knowledge. He had read several books all the way through. One of them was Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, in which he firmly believed. Ichabod Crane was a little clever, but also gullible. No tale was too strange or too shocking for him to believe. After school let out, he would read old Mather's fearful tales until it grew too dark to see the words. Then he went by swamp and stream and awful woodland to the farmhouse where he was staying. Every sound of nature at that witching hour fluttered his excited imagination. The moan of the whippoorwill or the cry of the tree-toad sounded like ghosts. He jumped at the hooting of the screech owl, or birds rustling in the thicket. If a huge beetle blundered against him, the poor rascal thought he had been struck by a witch's token. His only hope was to sing hymns. The people of Sleepy Hollow often heard his nasal melody floating from the distant hills along the road. Another fearful pleasure was to spend winter evenings with the old Dutch wives. They sat spinning by the fire with a row of apples roasting on the hearth. He listened to their tales of ghosts and goblins. They told of haunted fields and haunted brooks and haunted bridges and haunted houses. He listened especially to the tale of the Headless Horseman. Then he would delight them with stories of witchcraft. He frightened them with warnings about comets and shooting stars. He also shared the alarming fact that the world turned around. They spent half of their time upside down. There was pleasure in this, snug in a room with a crackling wood fire. There, of course, no specter dared to show its face. It was paid for, though, by the terrors of his walk home. What fearful shadows stalked his steps in the dim glare of a snowy night! How wistfully he eyed every ray of light streaming from some distant window! How often was he alarmed by some shrub covered with snow, like a shrouded spirit! He dreaded to look over his shoulder. Perhaps some monster was tramping close behind him. And he was often dismayed by some rushing blast, howling among the trees. He could not shake the idea that it was the Headless Horseman on one of his nightly patrols. All these, however, were only terrors of the night. Daylight put an end to them. He would have had a pleasant life if his path had not been crossed by a being that mystifies mortal man more than ghosts, goblins, and witches all put together. That was a woman. Among his music students was one Katrina Van Tassel. 18 years old, she was the daughter and only child of a wealthy farmer. She was plump as a partridge and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches. Both her beauty and her large inheritance made her well known. She was a little bit of a flirt, and always dressed to show off her charms. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart for women. No wonder such a tempting morsel caught his eye, especially after he visited her father's mansion. Old Baltus Van Tassel was a thriving, contented, generous farmer. On his farm, everything was snug, happy, and well-maintained. His home was built on the banks of the Hudson in a green nook. A great elm tree spread its broad branches over it. At its foot bubbled up a spring of soft, sweet water. Then it sparkled away through the grass to a brook that babbled through the trees. Nearby was a barn, as big as a church. Every corner of it seemed to burst with treasure. The sound of grain being separated rang within it from morning to night. Rows of pigeons enjoyed the sunshine on the roof. Sleek fat hogs grunted in their pens, and suckling pigs came out to sniff the air. A squadron of snowy geese rode in a nearby pond, along with whole fleets of ducks. Regiments of turkeys gobbled through the farmyard. Guinea fowls fretted around them. Before the barn door strutted the brave rooster. A warrior and a husband, he clapped his copper wings and crowed in pride and gladness. Sometimes he tore up the earth with his feet. Then he generously called his hungry family of wives and children to enjoy what he had found. The educator's mouth watered as he looked at this promise of grand winter feasts. In his greedy mind, every little pig had an apple in his mouth. The pigeons were put to bed in a pie, tucked in with a covering of crust. The geese swam in their own gravy. The ducks were paired in dishes with onion sauce. The hogs were carved into sides of bacon and juicy ham. Each turkey he imagined trussed up, wearing a necklace of sausages. Even the rooster lay sprawled on his back in a dish, with claws raised. Then the spellbound Ichabod turned his great green eyes over the fat meadows. There were rich fields of wheat, rye, buckwheat, and corn. Orchards heavy with red fruit surrounded Van Tassel's home. His heart yearned for the girl who would inherit this empire. It could easily be turned into cash. The money could be invested in huge portions of wild land. His busy mind imagined Katrina with a whole family of children on top of a wagon. He saw himself riding a steady mare with a colt at her heels, setting out for Kentucky, Tennessee, or the Lord knows where. When he entered the house, the conquest of his heart was complete. It was spacious, with a peaked roof that sloped low. The eaves formed a porch along the front which could be closed up in bad weather. Under this were farming tools and fishing nets. Benches were built along the side. A great spinning wheel sat at one end and a butter churn at the other. Then the wondering Ichabod entered the hall. It formed the center of the mansion and was the main living space. Here, rows of gleaming metal dishes arranged on a long dresser dazzled his eyes. In one corner stood a huge bag of wool, ready to be spun. In another, a length of fabric had just come from the loom. Ears of corn and strings of dried apples and peaches hung in bright garlands along the walls, mixed with red peppers. A door left open gave him a peep into the best parlor. There, claw-footed chairs and dark wooden tables shone like mirrors. Fire irons glistened from their hiding place. Flowers and seashells decorated the mantel. Strings of colorful birds' eggs were strung above it, and a great ostrich egg was hung from the center of the room. A corner cupboard, left a little open, displayed old silver and well-mended china. From the moment Ichabod saw these rooms, his peace of mind was at an end. Now, his only thought was how to gain the affection of Van Tassel's daughter. In this task, however, he had more trouble than a knight of old. A knight only had giants, enchanters, and fiery dragons to deal with. Ichabod had to deal with fearful foes of real flesh and blood. Her many admirers guarded every way to her heart. They kept a watchful, angry eye on each other, but would fly out together against any new rival. The mightiest of these was a burly, roaring, lively young man called Brom Van Brunt. He was the hero of the country there, known for his strength and daring. He was broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short, curly black hair. His mighty frame was so strong he had received the nickname of Brom Bones. He was famous for his skill on horseback. He was first in all races and fights, and the judge of all disputes. He was always ready to fight, or frolic. In his roughness there was a strong dash of playful good humor. He had 3 or 4 close friends. At their head he crashed every feud or festivity for miles around. In cold weather he wore a fur cap, topped with a fox's tail. When folks spied this crest at a distance whisking about in a squad of riders, they knew there would be a commotion. Sometimes his crew dashed past the farmhouses at midnight with a whoop and a holler. The old ladies, startled out of their sleep, would exclaim, "There goes Brom Bones and his gang!" When any prank or brawl took place, the neighbors shook their heads and supposed that Brom Bones was at the bottom of it. This unruly hero had singled out Katrina for his attention. His romantic efforts were like the gentle caresses of a bear. Still, it was said that she did not discourage him. When his horse was tied to Van Tassel's fence, it was a sure sign that his master was courting within. All other suitors passed by in despair and tried their luck elsewhere. Such was the rival with whom Ichabod Crane had to compete. A braver man than he would have retreated. A wiser man would have despaired. He, however, was both flexible and persistent. Though he bent, he never broke. He bowed beneath the slightest pressure, but the moment it was away, jerk, he was as straight as ever. To openly challenge his rival would be madness. Instead, Ichabod visited the farmhouse in his role as singing master. He had nothing to fear from her parents. Balt Van Tassel was an easy soul, and loved his daughter even better than his pipe. He let her have her way in everything. His wife had enough to do to tend her house and manage her poultry. As she said, "Ducks and geese are foolish things and must be looked after, but girls can take care of themselves." While she worked her spinning wheel at one end of the porch, Balt would sit smoking his pipe at the other. In the meantime, Ichabod walked with the daughter under the great elm in the twilight. As soon as Ichabod Crane made his move, Brom Bones seemed to lose interest. His horse was no longer tied to the fences on Sunday nights. A deadly feud grew between him and the teacher of Sleepy Hollow. Brom had a rough idea of honor. He would have settled things like knights of old, by combat. Ichabod was too cautious to fight him. This left Brom no choice but to play practical jokes on his rival. Bones and his gang of rough riders smoked out his singing school by stopping up the chimney. They broke into the schoolhouse at night. They turned everything upside down until poor Ichabod began to think that witches held their meetings there. More annoyingly, Brom took every chance to ridicule him around Katrina. He taught a stray dog to whine and introduced it as her new singing teacher. Matters went on this way for some time. One fine autumn afternoon, Ichabod sat watching his students. They were busy with their books, or whispering behind them with one eye on the teacher. A buzzing stillness ruled. It was interrupted by a servant who came to the school door. He had an invitation for Ichabod. the teacher was asked to attend a party that evening at Mr. Van Tassel's. After he delivered his message, the servant scampered away up the hollow. All was now bustle and hubbub in the formerly quiet schoolroom. Ichabod hurried the scholars through their lessons without stopping. Those who were quick boldly skipped over half. Those who were slow had a smack now and then on the rear to increase their speed or help them over a tall word. Books were flung aside without being put away. Inkstands were overturned. Benches were thrown down. The whole school was turned loose an hour before the usual time and burst forth like a pack of young devils. They yelped and ran about the woods in joy at their early release. The noble Ichabod now spent at least an extra half-hour getting ready. He brushed and polished his rusty black suit. He arranged his hair with the help of a broken mirror. He even borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he was staying, the irritable old Hans Van Ripper. Thus boldly mounted, he rode forth like a knight in quest of adventures. But I should describe my hero and his steed. The animal he rode was a broken-down plough-horse. He had outlived almost everything but viciousness. Gaunt and shaggy, he had a sagging neck and a head like a hammer. His rusty mane and tail were tangled and knotted with burrs. One eye was a blind, ghostly white, but the other had the gleam of a devil in it. Still, he must have had fire and courage in his day, because he was named Gunpowder. He had, in fact, been a favorite steed of his master's. The bad-tempered Van Ripper was a furious rider. He had probably put some of his own spirit into the animal. Old and broken down as he looked, there was more of the devil lurking in him than in any young filly in the country. Ichabod was a fitting rider for such a steed. He rode with his knees nearly up to the pommel of the saddle. His sharp elbows stuck out like grasshoppers' legs, and he carried his whip in his hand like a scepter. As his horse jogged on, his arms moved like a pair of flapping wings. A small wool hat slipped down to the top of his nose, and his black coat fluttered out behind him. Ichabod and his mount shambled out of the gate, a sight that is seldom seen in broad daylight. It was, as I have said, a fine autumn day. The sky was clear, and nature wore her richest gold. The forests had put on sober brown and yellow, while some trees had been nipped by the frost into brilliant orange, purple, and scarlet. Streaming lines of wild ducks appeared high in the air. Squirrels barked in the hickory trees. Now and then, the low whistle of a quail came from nearby fields of stubble. Birds fluttered, chirping and frolicking from bush to bush and tree to tree. There was the robin. Twittering blackbirds flew in clouds. The golden-winged woodpecker showed his red crest and his broad black collar. Next came the cedar bird, with its red-tipped wings and yellow-tipped tail. Finally, the noisy blue jay appeared in his light blue coat and white underclothes. He sat screaming and chattering, and pretended to be on good terms with every singer in the grove. As Ichabod rode on, he looked with delight at the treasures of autumn. Vast stores of apples were on all sides. Farther on were great fields of corn. Yellow pumpkins lay beneath them. Soon he passed the fragrant buckwheat fields. Soft visions stole into his mind of dainty flapjacks, well buttered, drizzled with honey, by the delicate little hand of Katrina Van Tassel. It was almost evening when Ichabod arrived at the Van Tassel home. It was already crowded with old leather-faced farmers and their brisk, withered little wives. Curvy lasses were almost as old-fashioned as their mothers. The sons wore short coats boasting rows of bright brass buttons. Their hair was tied into tails, in the fashion of the times. Brom Bones was the hero of the scene. He had come to the gathering on his favorite horse, Daredevil. It was a creature like himself, full of boldness and mischief. No one but he could manage it. He preferred vicious animals, given to all kinds of dangerous tricks. Now I must pause to mention the charms that captivated the gaze of my hero as he entered Van Tassel's mansion. Not the beautiful lasses. No, he preferred the charms of a Dutch country tea table. He saw doughnuts and crullers. There were sweet cakes and shortcakes, ginger cakes and honey cake, and then there were apple pies and peach pies and pumpkin pies, besides slices of ham and smoked beef. There were dishes of preserved plums and peaches and pears. I must not forget the broiled fish and roasted chickens, or the bowls of milk and cream. The teapot sent up clouds of vapor from the center. But I am too eager to get on with my story to discuss this banquet as it deserves. Happily, Ichabod Crane was not in such a hurry. He looked around him as he ate, chuckling. Just think, he might one day be lord of this luxury. Old Baltus Van Tassel moved among his guests, round and jolly as the harvest moon. He shook their hands, slapped their shoulders, and laughed. He invited them to help themselves. The sound of music from the common room summoned them to dance. Ichabod prided himself on his dancing as much as his singing. As he clattered about the room, he was admired by all. The lady of his heart was his partner, and she smiled at him. Meanwhile, Brom Bones sat alone in one corner, brooding jealously. When the dance was over, Ichabod was drawn to a knot of the wiser folks. With old Van Tassel they sat and smoked at one end of the porch. They gossiped about times past, telling long stories about the war. The British and American lines had run near them, and they had seen all kinds of border fighting. Just enough time had passed to allow each storyteller to dress up his tale as he chose. In the haze of his memory, he could make himself the hero of every adventure. But all these were nothing to the tales of ghosts and ghouls that followed. Several of the Sleepy Hollow people were there. As usual, they shared their wild and wonderful legends. Dismal tales were told about wailing heard near the tree where the unfortunate Major Andre was taken. They spoke of the woman in white that shrieked on winter nights before a storm. Most of the stories, however, focused on the Headless Horseman. He had been heard several times lately by the church. On one side of the church was a large brook where there was once a wooden bridge. The road that led to it and the bridge itself were thickly shaded by overhanging trees. This cast a gloom about it, even in the daytime. At night it caused a fearful darkness. This was the place where the Headless Horseman was most often encountered. The tale was told of old Brower, who did not believe in ghosts. He met the horseman coming back from Sleepy Hollow and was forced to get up behind him. They galloped over bush and brambles, over hill and swamp until they reached the bridge. There, the horseman suddenly turned into a skeleton and threw old Brower into the brook. Then he sprang away over the treetops with a clap of thunder. Brom Bones then shared an adventure 3 times more marvelous. One night, he claimed, he had been overtaken by the horseman and offered to race with him. He should have won, too. Daredevil beat the goblin horse all hollow. Just as they came to the church bridge, though, the Headless Horseman bolted and vanished in a flash of fire. These tales were told in the dark, lit only now and then by the gleam of fire from a pipe. They sank deep into Ichabod's mind. He repaid them with long stories from the author Cotton Mather. Then he shared the fearful sights he had seen in his nightly walks about Sleepy Hollow. The party soon broke up. The old farmers gathered their families in their wagons and rattled away over the hills. Some of the young women climbed on saddles behind their favorite suitors. Their laughter and the clatter of hooves echoed through the silent woods until they too died away. Soon all was silent and deserted. Only Ichabod stayed behind to speak with the heiress. He was convinced that he was on the high road to success. What happened in this interview I will not say, for I do not know. Something, I fear, must have gone wrong. He came out again quickly, quite discouraged. Oh, these women! These women! Could that girl have been playing tricks? Was her encouragement of the poor schoolmaster all a plot to catch his rival? Heaven only knows, not I. Without looking to the right or left, Ichabod went straight to the stable. With strong kicks, he rudely roused his steed from his comfortable sleep. He had been dreaming of mountains of corn and oats, and whole valleys of clover. It was the witching hour of the night. Ichabod, gloomy and crestfallen, began his long ride home. Far below, the Tappan Zee spread its dusky waters. In the dead hush of midnight, he could hear a watchdog barking on the opposite shore. Now and then the crowing of a rooster, accidentally awakened, would sound far, far off. There were no signs of life near him, except for the occasional chirp of a cricket or twang of a bullfrog. The stories of ghosts and goblins he had heard that afternoon crowded into his mind. The night grew darker and darker. The stars seemed to sink deeper into the sky, and clouds sometimes hid them. He had never felt so lonely. More than that, he was approaching the very spot where many of the ghost stories took place. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree. It towered like a giant above all the other trees, its branches gnarled and strange. They twisted down almost to the earth and rose again into the air. The unfortunate Andre had been taken prisoner nearby. The common people regarded the tree with both respect and superstition. Tales of strange sights and sorrowful sounds were told about it. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered, but it was only a blast of wind seeping through the dry branches. As he came a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the middle of the tree. He paused and stopped whistling. Looking more closely, he saw that it was a place where the tree had been scarred by lightning, exposing the white wood. Suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered, and his knees banged against the saddle, but it was only the rubbing of one huge bough upon another. He passed the tree safely, but new perils lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road. A few logs laid side by side served as a bridge over this stream. On one side of the road, the brook entered the wood by a thick stand of trees. They threw a cavernous gloom over it. To pass this bridge was the worst trial, for it was at this very spot that the unfortunate Andre was captured. Ever since, it had been considered a haunted stream. Fearful is the one who has to pass it alone, after dark. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He gave his horse a dozen kicks in the ribs and tried to dash across the bridge. Instead of starting forward, however, the wicked old animal went sideways against a fence. Ichabod, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the reins and kicked hard. His steed plunged across the road into a thicket of brambles. The teacher now used both whip and heel upon Gunpowder's starved old ribs. He dashed forward, snorting, but stopped just by the bridge. So suddenly he nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head. Just then, a splash beside the bridge caught Ichabod's ear. In the shadow of the grove, he saw something huge, misshapen, and towering. It did not stir. It seemed like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveler. The teacher's hair rose up on his head with terror. What could he do? It was too late to turn and fly. Besides, what chance was there of escaping a ghost which could ride on the wings of the wind? Therefore, in a show of courage, he stammered, "Who are you?" There was no reply. He repeated his demand in a more agitated voice. Still, there was no answer. Once more he pounded the sides of the inflexible gunpowder, and shutting his eyes, broke forth into a hymn. Just then the shadowy object bounded into the middle of the road. Though the night was dark, the unknown might now be seen a little. He appeared to be a large horseman, mounted on a powerful black horse. He did not move to attack or speak, but kept on one side of the road, jogging along on old Gunpowder's blind side. The horse had now got over his fear and rebellion. Ichabod thought of the adventure of Brom Bones with the galloping Hessian. He now quickened his steed in hopes of leaving him behind. The stranger, however, quickened his horse as well. Ichabod slowed to a walk, thinking to lag behind. The other did the same. His heart began to sink. He tried to resume his hymn, but his parched tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. He could not sing a note. There was something awful and mysterious in the silence of this stubborn companion. It was soon fearfully explained. As they climbed a hill, his fellow traveler was outlined against the sky. He was gigantic and wrapped in a cloak. Ichabod was horrified to see that he was headless. The head, instead of resting on his shoulders, was carried before him on his saddle. His terror made him desperate. He kicked Gunpowder to make him run, hoping to give his companion the slip, but the spectre stayed with him. Away they dashed through thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. Ichabod stretched his body forward over his horse's head, eager to escape. They had now reached the road that turns off to Sleepy Hollow. Gunpowder seemed possessed by a demon. Instead of following the main road, he plunged downhill to the left. That road leads through a hollow for about 1/4 of a mile, where it crosses the haunted bridge. Just beyond rises the green hill on which stands the church. So far, the panic of the steed had given his awkward rider an advantage. Just as he got halfway through the hollow, though, the straps of the saddle broke. Ichabod felt it slipping out from under him. He tried to hold it firm, but in vain. He had just enough time to save himself by grabbing old Gunpowder around the neck. When the saddle fell, he heard it trampled underfoot by his pursuer. The goblin was hard on his heels, and he had trouble keeping his seat. Sometimes he slipped to one side, sometimes to another. Sometimes he jolted on the high ridge of his horse's backbone, so hard he feared it would split him in two. An opening in the trees now led him to hope that the church bridge was at hand. It was the place where Brom Bones's ghostly competitor had disappeared. If I can only reach that bridge, thought Ichabod, I am safe. Just then, he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even thought he felt its hot breath. Another kick in the ribs and old Gunpowder sprang up on the bridge. He thundered over the planks to the opposite side. Now Ichabod looked behind to see if his pursuer would vanish in a flash of fire and brimstone. Instead, he saw the goblin rise in his stirrups and hurl his head at him. Ichabod tried to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It hit his skull with a crash. He tumbled headlong into the dust. Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning, the old horse was found without his saddle, eating the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not come to breakfast. Dinner time came, but no Ichabod. The boys met at the school, but there was no schoolmaster. Hans Van Ripper began to feel uneasy about poor Ichabod and his saddle. After some investigation, he found his tracks. The saddle was found trampled in the dirt. The marks of horses' hooves moving at furious speed were traced to the bridge. Beyond it, on the bank of the brook, he found the unfortunate Ichabod's hat. Close beside it sat a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but the teacher's body was not to be found. This mystery caused talk at the church on Sunday. Gossips collected in the churchyard, at the bridge, and at the spot where the hat and pumpkin had been found. They concluded that Ichabod had been carried off by the headless horseman. As he was not married and in nobody's debt, nobody worried any more about him. The school was moved to a different part of the hollow, and they found another teacher. This ghostly tale was shared by a farmer who visited New York several years later. He also brought the news that Ichabod Crane was still alive. He had left partly out of fear, and partly in shame at having been dismissed by the heiress. He moved far away, studied law, and was made a justice of the court. Brom Bones married Katrina shortly after his rival vanished. He looked very knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was told, and always laughed at the part about the pumpkin. This led some to suspect that he knew more about it than he chose to tell. The old country wives maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by the horseman. It is a favorite story, often told. The bridge became more haunted than ever. That may be why the road has been moved, to approach the church by another way. The deserted school is said to be haunted by the ghost of the unlucky teacher. Some have claimed they hear his voice at a distance, chanting a gloomy hymn in the peace of Sleepy Hollow. The end.